The wind carried dust and secrets across the Montana Territory in equal measure, and Sarah Mitchell had learned to hide behind both. She stood at the edge of Redemption Creek with a carpetbag that held everything she owned and a teaching certificate that wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. The town spread before her like a promise she didn't deserve, weathered buildings lining a rutted main street, smoke rising from chimneys into the crystalline autumn air, mountains standing guard in the distance like silent witnesses to all the lies that had come before and all the lies yet to be told. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her bonnet, though whether from the cold or from fear, she couldn't say. 3 weeks on the road had worn her down to something fragile and desperate. 3 weeks of looking over her shoulder, of sleeping in barns and haylofts, of rationing the last of her money until each coin felt precious as gold. 3 weeks of running from what she'd done in Chicago, from the marshal's warrant that bore her real name, from the woman she'd been before desperation had turned her into someone she no longer recognized. The teaching certificate had cost her the last of her jewelry, purchased from a forger in a Denver back alley who'd asked no questions and expected none in return. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, it proclaimed in elaborate script, was qualified to teach children in reading, writing, arithmetic, and moral instruction. The irony of that last bit sat bitter on her tongue. She had no business teaching anyone about morality, not after what she'd done. But she had every reason to need the new identity it provided, the respectable veneer of a profession that would ask few questions of a woman alone. The stage had deposited her an hour past noon, and already the sun was beginning its descent toward the peaks. October in Montana meant early darkness and cold that cut through wool and cotton like they were nothing. Sarah picked up her carpetbag, squared her shoulders, and started down the slope toward the town proper. Each step felt like a small surrender, another moment further from the woman she'd been and deeper into the deception she'd chosen. But what choice did she have? Prison waited behind her. A noose, perhaps, depending on how the judge viewed her crime. Forward was the only direction left. The schoolhouse sat at the far end of town, a modest clapboard structure with a bell tower that listed slightly to one side. Someone had painted it white once, but weather and time had eaten away the color to something closer to gray. Children's voices drifted from the open door, reciting multiplication tables in a ragged chorus that spoke of minds wandering toward the freedom that waited outside. Sarah's stomach tightened. She knew nothing about teaching children. She'd been a clerk in her uncle's accounting office before everything fell apart, her days spent with ledgers and numbers, not primers and slates. But she'd watched teachers when she was young. She remembered Miss Hartwell, stern and unyielding, who'd taught her letters with a ruler that cracked across knuckles for every mistake. She remembered Mr. Patterson, gentle and distracted, whose lessons wandered like streams, never quite reaching their destinations. Surely she could find some middle ground between those extremes. Surely she could pretend long enough to establish herself, to become real in this place, to make her false identity so solid that no one would think to question it. The door to the general store stood open, and Sarah could see a woman inside arranging canned goods on a shelf. This seemed as good a place as any to announce herself. She climbed the 2 wooden steps, her boots hollow on the planks, and stepped into the dim interior. The smell of coffee and leather and tobacco wrapped around her, familiar and strange all at once. Every general store she'd ever entered had smelled like this, as though commerce itself had a scent that transcended geography. The woman turned at the sound of footsteps, and Sarah found herself facing someone near her own age, perhaps 30, with auburn hair pinned in a practical bun and eyes that assessed without judging. A kindness lived in that face, something that made Sarah's heart ache with the weight of her own dishonesty. "Help you, miss?" The woman's voice carried the softness of the South, smoothed by years in harder country but not entirely erased. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she said, and the name felt foreign in her mouth, like a coat that didn't quite fit. "The new schoolteacher. I've just arrived on the stage." The woman's face transformed with a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "Oh, thank the Lord. We've been without a teacher for near on 2 months now, since Mrs. Henderson had her baby and decided she couldn't manage both the school and a household. I'm Grace Winters. My husband, Thomas, runs the mercantile with me." She wiped her hands on her apron and extended one toward Sarah. "You must be exhausted from your journey. Where did you travel from?" "Denver," Sarah said, which was true enough for the last leg of her flight. She took Grace's hand, felt the strength in it, the calluses that spoke of hard work honestly done. Everything about this woman radiated decency, and Sarah felt like a stain in her presence. "It was a long journey." "I imagine so. Have you found lodgings yet?" "Mrs. Anderson usually takes in the teacher, but she's visiting her sister in Helena this month. You're welcome to stay with us until she returns, if you don't mind a house full of noise. We've got 3 little ones, and they're as wild as March hares most days." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back, maintaining the composure she'd practiced for weeks. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Winters. I wouldn't want to impose." "Grace, please. And it's no imposition. Truth be told, I could use another woman's company. The men in this town outnumber us 3 to 1, and sensible conversation gets scarce." Grace moved toward the door, already making decisions, already pulling Sarah into the fabric of this place. "Come on, I'll show you where you'll be staying. Thomas can watch the store for a bit. The schoolhouse is just down the way, and we can stop there so you can see what you'll be working with." Sarah followed because there was nothing else to do, because Grace's certainty left no room for refusal. They walked together down the rutted street, past the saloon where men's laughter spilled out into the afternoon, past the blacksmith shop where hammer rang against anvil in a rhythm as old as civilization. Grace talked as they walked, filling Sarah in on the town's geography and population, on who had children of school age and who might cause trouble. The Hendersons had 5, all boys, and the youngest was prone to mischief. The Carlsons had 3 girls, sweet and studious. The Flynns had a son who was brilliant but difficult, who'd driven Mrs. Henderson to tears more than once. The information washed over Sarah like a river, too much to hold on to all at once. She nodded and made small noises of understanding, but her mind was racing ahead, trying to calculate how long she could maintain this fiction, how thoroughly she'd have to become Sarah Mitchell to survive. A month, she thought. Maybe 2. Long enough for the search to move elsewhere, for the marshal to follow false leads into other territories. Long enough to save enough money to move on, to find some other town, some other identity. The schoolhouse looked no better up close than it had from a distance. The steps creaked under their weight, and the door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Inside, benches sat in uneven rows facing a battered desk and a slate board that had seen better decades. Books were stacked haphazardly on a shelf in the corner, their spines cracked and faded. The whole place smelled of chalk dust and children and time. "I know it's not much," Grace said, and there was apology in her voice. "The town does what it can, but money's tight for everyone. Most families pay the teacher's salary in goods rather than cash. You'll find yourself with more vegetables and venison than you know what to do with come harvest time." Sarah walked to the desk and ran her hand across its scarred surface. Someone had carved initials into one corner, J.H. plus M.T., and she wondered what had become of those children, whether they'd stayed in Redemption Creek or fled to bigger dreams. "It's fine," she said, and meant it. She'd expected nothing, so anything at all felt like abundance. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow, if you're able. The children have been running wild without structure, and their parents are at their wits' end. School runs from 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, with an hour break at midday." Grace moved to the bookshelf and pulled down a worn primer. Mrs. Henderson left her lesson plans, such as they were. "You'll have students ranging from 6 to 14, all in the same room. The older ones help teach the younger ones, mostly. It's not like the fancy schools back east." No, Sarah thought, it was nothing like the schools back east, Nothing like the orderly academy she'd attended as a girl, where each grade had its own classroom and teachers specialized in their subjects. This was frontier education, rough and improvised, and she had no idea how to manage it. But she would learn. She had to learn. Her freedom depended on it. They left the schoolhouse as the afternoon light was beginning to slant golden through the windows. Grace led her to a tidy house at the north end of town, painted yellow with white trim and a garden out front that had been put to bed for winter. Pumpkins sat on the porch steps, and a wreath of dried corn hung on the door. It looked like the picture of domestic happiness, the kind of home Sarah had once dreamed of having before her life had taken its dark turn. Thomas Winters was a tall man with a gentle manner and eyes that smiled even when his mouth was serious. He welcomed Sarah without hesitation, as though taking in strangers was simply what one did in this country. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, stared at her with the frank curiosity of the young, and Sarah found herself smiling back despite the weight in her chest. When had she last been around children? Years, perhaps. They seemed like creatures from another world, loud and uncomplicated and free in ways she'd forgotten existed. Grace showed her to a small room under the eaves, simply furnished with a bed, a washstand, and a trunk for belongings. A quilt covered the bed, pieced together from scraps of fabric in a pattern that spoke of patience and care. A rag rug warmed the floor. A single window looked out over the garden and beyond it to the mountains, purple and gold in the fading light. "It's not fancy," Grace said, hovering in the doorway, "but it's clean and the roof doesn't leak much." "It's perfect," Sarah said, and something in her voice must have carried more emotion than she intended because Grace's expression softened with concern. "You all right, Sarah? You look about ready to collapse." And she was, Sarah realized. The weeks of running, of fear, of sleeping light and eating little had caught up with her all at once. Now that she'd stopped moving, now that she'd reached something like safety, exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. "Just tired," she managed. "It's been a long journey. Then rest before supper. I'll call you when it's ready." Grace pulled the door closed with a soft click, and Sarah was alone. She stood for a moment in the center of the small room, her carpetbag still clutched in one hand, and felt the enormity of what she'd done settle over her like a shroud. She'd run from Chicago with stolen money in her bag, money she'd taken from her uncle's safe in a moment of desperation and fury after learning he'd gambled away her inheritance, money that was meant to keep her from ending up on the streets or worse. She'd told herself it was rightfully hers, that he'd stolen from her first, but the law wouldn't see it that way. The law would see a thief, plain and simple. And now she was here, in a town full of good people who'd welcomed her without question, preparing to teach their children while lying about everything she was. The weight of it pressed down on her shoulders until she thought she might crumble beneath it. Sarah set down her carpetbag and sank onto the bed. The quilt was soft beneath her hands, worn smooth by use and washing. Someone had made this with love, stitching together scraps to create something beautiful and useful. She thought of all the hands that might have touched it over the years, all the people who'd slept beneath it and dreamed their dreams. What would they think if they knew what she was? What would Grace think, kind Grace who'd opened her home without hesitation? The tears came then, silent and hot, sliding down her cheeks and dripping onto the quilt. She cried for what she'd lost, for the woman she'd been before desperation had made her a criminal, for the future she'd imagined that would never come to pass now. She cried for the loneliness that had been her companion for weeks, for the fear that woke her in the night with her heart pounding and her breath caught in her throat. She cried until she had no tears left, until she was empty and wrung out and somehow lighter for it. When Grace called her to supper an hour later, Sarah had washed her face and pinned her hair and composed herself into someone who looked like a respectable schoolteacher. She descended the stairs with her spine straight and her expression calm, and if her eyes were still red, no one mentioned it. The Winters family gathered around a table laden with pot roast and potatoes and fresh bread, and they bowed their heads while Thomas said grace. Sarah bowed hers too, though she had no idea what she was praying for any more. Forgiveness, perhaps. or just the strength to keep lying long enough to survive? The children chattered through the meal, telling stories about their days and asking Sarah questions she deflected as gracefully as she could. Where had she taught before? A small school in Denver, she lied. Did she have family? Not anymore, she said, which was true enough. Her parents were long dead, and her uncle was worse than dead to her now. Why had she come to Montana? For a fresh start, she answered, and that at least wasn't entirely a lie. What she'd found in Redemption Creek was a chance to become someone else entirely, someone clean and new and unburdened by past mistakes. After supper, Grace insisted Sarah rest more while she and Thomas cleaned up. Sarah retreated to her borrowed room and sat by the window, watching darkness settle over the town. Lamps flickered to life in windows, small beacons of warmth against the cold. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere a baby cried. The ordinary sounds of life continuing, of people secure in their homes and their identities, of a world where most folks had nothing to hide. She thought about tomorrow, about standing in front of a classroom full of children who would look to her for guidance and knowledge. She thought about how little she had to offer them beyond basic arithmetic and whatever she could remember from her own schooling. She thought about how every moment would be a performance, every interaction a potential trap where she might slip and reveal herself. But she also thought about Grace's kindness, about the warmth of the winter's home, about the way Thomas had welcomed her without suspicion. She thought about the quilt on the bed and the rug on the floor, about the care someone had taken to make this small room comfortable for a stranger. There was goodness in this place, she realized. Real goodness, the kind she'd thought was just a story people told themselves to make the world seem less harsh than it was. Maybe, she thought, she could become the person they thought she was. Maybe if she pretended long enough, the pretense would become real. Maybe Sarah Mitchell, the schoolteacher, could be born fully formed from the ashes of whoever she'd been before, and the woman who'd fled Chicago could fade like a bad dream in morning light. It was a fragile hope, as thin as the paper her forged certificate was printed on. But it was hope nonetheless, and Sarah had been without hope for so long that even this small flicker felt like a candle lit against the dark. She undressed and slipped beneath the quilt, and despite her exhaustion, sleep was slow to come. Her mind kept racing through scenarios, through all the ways her deception might be discovered, through all the lies she'd need to tell to sustain the first lie. But eventually weariness won, and she drifted into dreams where she was someone else entirely, someone who belonged in a place like this, someone who deserved the kindness strangers offered. Morning came too soon, announced by roosters and the clatter of Grace moving around the kitchen below. Sarah rose and dressed in her simplest dress, gray wool that was respectable without being fancy, and pinned her dark hair into a severe bun that she hoped made her look like a proper teacher. She studied herself in the small mirror above the washstand and practiced her expression. Calm, confident, authoritative without being harsh. She looked older than her 28 years, she thought. The journey had carved lines around her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before. Breakfast was porridge and eggs and coffee strong enough to strip paint. The children ate with the single-minded intensity of the young, barely pausing to breathe between bites. Thomas read from a week-old newspaper, shaking his head over news from back east. Grace moved between table and stove with practiced efficiency, making sure everyone had what they needed before sitting down herself. "Nervous?" she asked Sarah, passing the cream. "A little," Sarah admitted, which was perhaps the most honest thing she'd said since arriving. "They're good children, mostly. Just energetic. Don't let the Flynn boy get under your skin. He's smart as a whip, but he knows it, and he'll test you to see what he can get away with. And the Henderson boys are rough around the edges, but their hearts are good." Grace poured herself more coffee and wrapped her hands around the cup. Mrs. Henderson used to say the trick was to be firm but fair. Let them know you care about their learning, but don't let them run wild. They'll respect you for it. Sarah nodded, committing this advice to memory along with everything else she was trying to absorb. Firm but fair. She could do that. She'd been on the receiving end of enough unfairness in her life to know how not to treat children. That was something, at least. She left the house at 7:30, giving herself time to reach the schoolhouse and prepare before the children arrived. The morning air was sharp and cold, her breath pluming white in the early light. Frost sparkled on the ground, and the mountains wore caps of new snow that hadn't been there yesterday. Winter was coming fast to this high country, and Sarah wondered what it would be like to spend the dark months here, to teach through storms and cold, to become part of this place's rhythm of seasons. If she lasted that long. If her secret stayed buried. If the marshal's search never reached this far. The schoolhouse was cold inside, colder somehow than the air outside. Sarah found wood stacked beside the stove and kindling in a box, and she set about building a fire with hands that remembered this task from childhood. Her mother had taught her, before the fever took her, how to lay kindling just so and add wood in the right order to coax flame from spark. The memory rose sharp and sweet, one of the few good ones Sarah had left, and she held on to it as the fire caught and began to spread warmth through the frigid room. She spent the remaining time examining Mrs. Henderson's lesson plans, trying to make sense of the sprawling notes and crossed-out sections. There were lists of books to read, arithmetic problems to solve, geography lessons about states and territories most of these children would never see. There were notes about individual students. Jenny Carlson excels at spelling, Mark Henderson needs extra help with sums, Daniel Flynn reads at a level far beyond his years but refuses to apply himself to subjects he finds boring. Sarah was still reading when the first students arrived, 3 girls who entered shyly and stood just inside the door as though unsure whether they were allowed to proceed. She recognized them from Grace's description. The Carlson sisters, probably, with their matching blonde braids and nervous smiles. "Good morning," Sarah said, standing and moving around the desk. "I'm Miss Mitchell, your new teacher. Please come in and take your seats." They scurried to a bench near the front, whispering to each other behind their hands. More children trickled in over the next few minutes, in pairs and groups and one by one. Sarah greeted each of them, learning names and faces, trying to match children to the descriptions Grace had given her. The Henderson boys arrived in a rowdy cluster, all elbows and energy, and immediately started roughhousing in the back of the room. Sarah was about to reprimand them when an older boy, Daniel Flynn, she was certain, spoke up. "Knock it off, you lot. Can't you see we've got a new teacher? Try to act civilized for 5 minutes." The Henderson boys subsided with sheepish grins, and Daniel took a seat in the middle of the room, his expression carefully neutral. He was perhaps 13, tall for his age and carrying himself with the confidence of someone who knew he was smarter than most people around him. His eyes when they met Sarah's held a challenge, a question. "What kind of teacher are you going to be?" Sarah held his gaze for a moment, then smiled slightly and turned to the board. "Good morning, class. As your schoolmate mentioned, I'm Miss Mitchell. I've come from Denver to teach here in Redemption Creek, and I'm looking forward to getting to know all of you." She picked up a piece of chalk, and it felt foreign in her hand, too light and fragile. "We're going to start today by finding out what you've learned so far. I'd like each of you to tell me your name, your age, and what subject you enjoy most." It was a simple exercise, one that bought her time to assess her students while they revealed themselves to her. The younger children were shy, their voices barely above whispers as they gave their names. The older ones were more confident, some eager to please and others radiating the kind of adolescent boredom that said they'd rather be anywhere else. Daniel Flynn, when his turn came, said he was 13 and enjoyed reading, his tone implying that nothing else in the curriculum was worth his time. "What are you reading currently?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. "Ivanhoe," he said, and there was a flicker of surprise in his expression that she'd engaged rather than dismissed him. "Walter Scott. An excellent choice. Have you read any of his other works?" "Rob Roy. And I've started The Lady of the Lake, but the poetry is tough going." Sarah felt something click into place, a small connection forming. Poetry often is. But Scott rewards persistence. We might read some of his work aloud in class, if you'd like. Sometimes hearing it helps make sense of it. Daniel's carefully neutral expression cracked just slightly, showing something that might have been interest or even pleasure. That'd be all right, I suppose. The rest of the introductions proceeded more smoothly after that. Sarah sensed that by engaging Daniel rather than treating him as a troublemaker, she'd earned a small measure of respect from the other students. They were watching her, she realized, trying to figure out what kind of teacher she'd be, whether she'd be harsh or kind or simply indifferent. Everything she did today would set the tone for all the days that followed. She divided them into groups by age and ability, setting the youngest children to copying their letters while she worked with the middle group on arithmetic. The oldest students, including Daniel, she assigned an essay on what they'd done over the summer months. It wasn't elegant teaching, but it was functional, and she was surprised to find that it felt almost natural once she'd begun. The children were eager to learn, for the most part, and even the Henderson boys settled down once they had tasks to occupy their hands and minds. The morning passed in a blur of activity and adjustment. Sarah moved from group to group, answering questions and offering guidance, and she was so focused on the work that she almost forgot to be afraid. Almost forgot that she was pretending, that every moment was a lie built on lies. The children needed her attention, and that need was immediate and real in a way nothing else had been for weeks. At midday she dismissed them for their lunch break, and they poured out of the schoolhouse in a torrent of noise and energy, racing toward freedom and food. Sarah sank into the chair at her desk and realized her hands were shaking from exhaustion and relief. She'd survived the morning. It was a small victory, but she'd take it. She ate the lunch Grace had packed for her, bread and cheese and an apple, while reviewing what she'd learned about her students. They were good children, just as Grace had promised. Rough in places, unpolished, but fundamentally decent. They deserved better than a teacher who was lying to them about everything, who might disappear one day without warning when her past caught up with her. But they also deserved someone who would try, Sarah thought. Someone who would show up each day and do her best to teach them what they needed to know. And that, at least, she could give them. However long she was here, she could be present and committed. It wasn't redemption. She wasn't naive enough to think teaching could erase what she'd done, but it was something better than running. It was purpose, however temporary. The afternoon session was more challenging than the morning. The children came back from lunch rowdy and unfocused, full of energy that had no outlet in the confines of the schoolhouse. Sarah had them read aloud, taking turns with passages from a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe, and the story seemed to capture their attention enough to settle them. She found herself getting caught up in it too, in Crusoe's isolation and his struggle to build a life from nothing. There was something uncomfortably familiar in that narrative, in the idea of being cut off from everything you'd known and having to recreate yourself from scratch. When 3 o'clock finally arrived and she dismissed the class, Sarah felt wrung out and oddly satisfied. She'd done it. She'd taught a full day of school without anyone discovering her secret, without anyone questioning her qualifications. The children had learned something, maybe, and more importantly, they'd been safe and occupied for 7 hours. Their parents would be pleased, and that would buy her more time. She stayed in the schoolhouse after the last child left, straightening benches and organizing books, putting off the moment when she'd have to go back to the Winters home and continue pretending to be Sarah Mitchell, respectable schoolteacher. The quiet was soothing after the chaos of the day, and she found herself reluctant to leave it. But eventually the cold drove her out. She banked the fire and closed the door behind her, stepping into late afternoon light that painted everything gold and amber. The town looked almost pretty in this light, almost like a place where someone might actually want to build a life rather than just hide for a while. Grace was waiting when Sarah returned, eager to hear how the day had gone. Sarah found herself talking more than she'd intended, describing the children and their quirks, the challenges and small victories. Grace listened with the attention of someone who genuinely cared, and Sarah felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen just slightly. Maybe this could work, she thought. Maybe she could stay here long enough to save some money, to plan her next move more carefully. Maybe she could even let herself relax into this life for a little while, pretend it was real, pretend she belonged. That night she wrote in the small journal she'd purchased in Denver, recording her thoughts and observations about her first day of teaching. It was dangerous, keeping a record that could be used against her, but she needed some outlet for the thoughts that crowded her mind. She wrote carefully, never using her real name, never mentioning Chicago or her uncle or the circumstances that had brought her here. To anyone reading it, the journal would seem to belong to exactly who she claimed to be, a young teacher finding her way in a frontier town. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was almost comfortable. Wake with the roosters, breakfast with the Winters family, walk to the schoolhouse and build the fire, teach from 8 to 3, return to Grace's hospitality and warmth. The children learned her ways and she learned theirs, and while she wouldn't claim to be an excellent teacher, she thought she was at least adequate. The parents seemed satisfied, sending their children each day with lunch pails and slates, occasionally stopping by the schoolhouse to check on progress. Sarah found herself liking the work more than she'd expected. There was satisfaction in watching comprehension dawn in a child's eyes, in seeing someone struggle with a concept and then suddenly grasp it. The younger children especially responded to patience and encouragement, blooming under attention in ways that suggested they didn't get much of it at home. The older children were more challenging, particularly Daniel Flynn, who remained skeptical of her abilities and tested her knowledge at every opportunity. But Sarah discovered she enjoyed the challenge of matching wits with him. Daniel was brilliant, that much was clear, and he was bored by lessons that came too easily. So she started bringing him more difficult material, borrowed from Thomas Winter's small collection of books. She assigned him algebra when the other students were still mastering basic arithmetic. She had him read Shakespeare and asked him to explain the language to his classmates. She gave him problems that required real thought, and she was gratified to see him engage with them fully, his skepticism gradually transforming into something like respect. 3 weeks into her tenure as Redemption Creek schoolteacher, Sarah Mitchell began to believe she might actually survive this deception. The rhythm of teaching had become second nature, and the children no longer watched her with the wary curiosity they'd shown that first day. She'd become part of the town's fabric, woven in through daily interactions and small kindnesses exchanged. Mrs. Anderson had returned from Helena and offered Sarah a room in her boarding house, a tiny space under the eaves that was hers alone. The privacy was both a relief and a burden. Relief because she no longer had to maintain her facade every waking moment, burden because solitude gave her too much time to think about what she'd done and what waited if she was ever discovered. The money she'd stolen sat hidden in a false bottom of her carpetbag, untouched except for the small amounts she'd used to pay for the forged certificate and her journey west. $3,000 in bills that represented her uncle's betrayal and her own desperate response to it. She told herself again what she'd told herself 100 times, that it was rightfully hers, that her uncle had gambled away the inheritance her father had meant for her, that she'd only taken what should have been hers by right. But the rationalization felt thinner each time she repeated it, worn smooth by use until she could see through it to the uncomfortable truth beneath. She'd stolen. However justified she felt, however wrong she'd been, the law would call it theft. The town was preparing for winter in earnest now, laying in supplies against the months of cold and isolation that lay ahead. Sarah watched the preparations with fascination and something close to dread. She'd grown up in Chicago, where winter meant shoveling walks and wearing extra layers, but it didn't mean being cut off from the world for months at a time. Here, once the heavy snows came, the town would be on its own until spring. No stages would run. No supplies would come. Whatever they had would have to last. Grace had taken it upon herself to make sure Sarah understood what was needed. "You'll want to stock up on candles and lamp oil," she advised one afternoon as they worked together in the mercantile, Sarah helping to inventory goods while Grace marked items in a ledger. "And extra wool if you've got any sewing skills. The winters here will test every seam in your clothing. You'll want long underwear. I know it's not ladylike to discuss, but modesty won't keep you warm when it's 20 below." Sarah had nodded and made mental notes, adding items to the list of things she'd need to purchase from her meager salary. The town paid her $30 a month plus room and board, which seemed like a fortune after weeks of rationing every penny. But Grace was teaching her that money went fast in a place where everything had to be shipped in at great expense. A pound of coffee cost what it would have cost for 5 pounds back east. Fabric was dear. Even basics like flour and sugar commanded premium prices. "You're looking worried," Grace observed, pausing in her counting. "Is the salary not enough? We could speak to the town council, see if they might manage a bit more." "No, it's generous," Sarah said quickly. "I'm just not used to frontier prices yet. Everything costs so much more than I expected." "That's the truth. Thomas and I barely scrape by most months, and we own the store." Grace set down her pencil and stretched, pressing her hands to the small of her back. "But we make do. Everyone does. That's the way of it out here. You learn to make do with what you have and be grateful for it." Making do. Sarah had been making do for weeks now, but she'd been doing it with the knowledge that she had $3,000 hidden away if she truly needed it. The thought of that money was both comfort and curse. Comfort because it meant she wouldn't starve if everything fell apart. Curse because she couldn't spend it without drawing attention, couldn't use it to ease her circumstances without explaining where it came from. The following Sunday, Sarah attended church for the first time since arriving in Redemption Creek. She'd been avoiding it, uncomfortable with the idea of sitting in a house of God while living a lie so comprehensive it touched every aspect of her life. But Grace had invited her with such genuine warmth, and Mrs. Anderson had mentioned that the whole town would notice if the schoolteacher didn't attend, and Sarah realized she had no choice. To refuse would raise questions she couldn't afford to answer. The church was a simple building, smaller even than the schoolhouse, with rough-hewn pews and a pulpit that looked like it had been built by someone with more enthusiasm than carpentry skill. Reverend Thompson was a lean man with kind eyes and a voice that carried surprising power when he preached. His sermon was about redemption, about how no sin was too great for God's forgiveness, about how the Lord specialized in taking broken things and making them whole. Sarah sat in the pew and felt each word like an accusation. She wanted to believe in redemption, wanted to think that she could somehow atone for what she'd done and become clean again. But how could there be redemption without confession? How could there be forgiveness when she was compounding her original sin with new lies every day? She was teaching children to be honest and moral while being neither herself. She was accepting the trust and friendship of good people while deceiving them about everything that mattered. After the service, people gathered outside to talk and socialize, and Sarah found herself surrounded by parents thanking her for her work with their children. Mrs. Henderson was particularly effusive, grateful that Sarah had managed to engage her unruly boys in a way she'd never quite mastered. "They actually want to go to school now," she marveled. "That's nothing short of a miracle, Miss Mitchell." The praise felt like ashes in Sarah's mouth, but she smiled and thanked them and tried to accept their gratitude with grace. She was good at pretending now. Too good. Sometimes she caught herself thinking as Sarah Mitchell rather than as the woman she'd been before, and that frightened her more than anything. She was disappearing into this fiction, losing herself in the role she'd created. Daniel Flynn approached her as the crowd was dispersing, his father's hand heavy on his shoulder. "My boy tells me you've been giving him extra work," Mr. Flynn said. He was a hard-faced man with the look of someone who'd been disappointed by life too many times to expect much from it. "Harder than what the other students get." Sarah's heart stuttered. Had she made a mistake? Pushed too hard? "Daniel is exceptionally bright," she said carefully. "I thought he might enjoy more challenging material. If you'd prefer I stop—" "I'd prefer you keep right on doing it," Mr. Flynn interrupted, and his stern expression cracked into something almost like a smile. "He's been reading at home for the first time since his mother passed. Can't get him to put the books down. Whatever you're doing, it's working. Just wanted to say thank you." The gratitude in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt it settle over her like a weight. These people trusted her with their children, with their most precious treasures. They believed she was who she claimed to be, and they were grateful for her presence in their lives. The responsibility of it was crushing. That night, alone in her small room at Mrs. Anderson's boarding house, Sarah took out the stolen money and counted it. $3,000 in bills of various denominations, worn from handling and carrying a faint smell of her uncle's cigars. Blood money, some might call it. Her only insurance against destitution. She held it in her hands and tried to feel something other than shame and fear, but those were the only emotions available. She thought about returning it, about putting it in an envelope and mailing it back to Chicago with an anonymous note. But that would draw attention to her location, would provide the marshal with a trail to follow. And besides, her uncle didn't deserve it back. He'd stolen from her first, had gambled away her inheritance and shown no remorse, had expected her to simply accept poverty and ruin as her lot in life. No, the money was hers. Maybe not legally, but morally, ethically, it belonged to her. She'd paid for it with her future, with her name, with any chance at a normal life. $3,000 was a pittance compared to what she'd lost. Sarah folded the bills carefully and returned them to their hiding place. Then she opened her journal and began to write, not about her day or her students, but about her uncle. About the father's brother who'd promised to look after her when her parents died, who'd taken control of her inheritance when she was just 17 and naive enough to trust him. About how he'd managed her father's money with the same careless disregard he showed for everything else in his life, making risky investments and worse bets, until the careful nest egg her father had built was gone like morning mist. About how she'd worked in his office for years, keeping his books, managing his affairs, covering for his mistakes. About how she'd discovered the extent of his losses only by accident, finding papers he'd hidden away showing that her inheritance, money that was supposed to keep her secure for life, had been reduced to almost nothing. About how she'd confronted him and he'd laughed, actually laughed, and told her she should be grateful he was giving her a job and a place to live. About how she'd waited until he was drunk and sleeping, had opened his safe with the combination she'd learned from watching him, and taken what she estimated her inheritance would have grown to if he'd invested it wisely instead of squandering it on cards and speculation. About how she'd walked out of his house in the dark hours before dawn and never looked back. Writing it all down didn't make her feel better, but it did make her feel less alone. The words on the page were witnesses to her pain and her justification, proof that she wasn't simply a thief but a woman who'd been wronged and had taken back what was rightfully hers. It didn't change the legal reality, but it changed something in her heart. The days grew shorter and colder as October gave way to November. The first serious snow came on a Tuesday, 6 inches overnight, that transformed the town into something from a storybook. The children arrived at school with red cheeks and snow-dampened clothes, excited by the novelty of it. Sarah let them talk about it for the first half hour, understanding that no real learning would happen until they'd expressed their enthusiasm. Then she wove the snow into their lessons. Mathematics problems about snowfall rates and accumulation, writing assignments describing the storm, geography lessons about climate and weather patterns. She was finding her stride as a teacher, discovering that the work suited her in ways she'd never expected. There was satisfaction in it, in watching comprehension dawn and skills develop. The children were responding to her methods, even the difficult ones. Daniel Flynn had become her unlikely ally, helping the younger students when they struggled and setting an example of intellectual curiosity that influenced his peers. The Henderson boys had settled into something approaching civilized behavior. Even the shyest children were beginning to participate, raising their hands and offering answers without prompting. But success brought its own dangers. The better she became at being Sarah Mitchell, the more people came to depend on that identity, the harder it would be to leave when the time came. And the time would come. She had no illusions about that. The marshal in Chicago wouldn't give up. Her uncle would make sure of that, would press for prosecution with the vindictive energy of a man whose pride had been wounded. Sooner or later, the search would reach Montana. Sooner or later, Someone would ask the right questions. Grace had become her closest friend in Redemption Creek, the person she came closest to trusting with pieces of her real self. They spent evenings together at the Winters home, sewing and talking while Thomas read his newspapers and the children played. Grace talked about her life before Redemption Creek, about growing up in Virginia and losing everything in the war, about coming west with Thomas to start over in a place where the past mattered less than what you could build for yourself. "That's what I love about the frontier," Grace said one evening, her needle moving with practiced efficiency through the shirt she was mending. "Out here, people don't much care where you came from or what you left behind. They care about who you are now, about whether you'll pull your weight and treat folks fairly. It's liberating, don't you think?" Sarah agreed, though she felt like a fraud doing so. Grace's fresh start had been honest, a genuine attempt to build something new. Sarah's fresh start was built on lies and theft and desperation. There was a world of difference between the two. "You ever think about marrying?" Grace asked suddenly, her tone carefully casual in a way that suggested she'd been waiting for the right moment to broach the subject. Sarah's hands stilled on her sewing. "I haven't much thought about it, no. Only there's several unmarried men in town who've noticed you. John Peterson at the lumber mill asked about you just yesterday. And I've seen the way Ben Cartwright looks at you after church." "I'm not looking for a husband," Sarah said firmly. The very idea was absurd. How could she marry anyone when she was living under a false name, when her real identity was wanted by the law? A marriage would require legal documents, official records. It would create exactly the kind of paper trail she needed to avoid. Grace looked disappointed but not surprised. "I understand. You want to establish yourself first, make sure you're secure in your position. That's wise. There's no rush. Just wanted you to know you've got options, that's all." Options. The word rang hollow in Sarah's mind. She had no options, not really. Every choice she made was constrained by the circumstances she'd created, by the lies she was living. She couldn't marry. She couldn't put down real roots. She couldn't even order a dress from a catalog without worrying that using her false name on an order form might somehow lead the authorities to her door. She was trapped in a life that looked like freedom but was actually a prison of her own making. December arrived with brutal cold and snow that piled in drifts against buildings and made the walk to school treacherous. Sarah learned to navigate ice and wind, to bundle herself in layers that made her feel like a shapeless lump but kept her from freezing. The schoolhouse was harder to heat now, the little stove struggling against the cold that seeped through every blemish in the walls. The children huddled close to the warmth, and Sarah found herself teaching with her coat on more often than not. But there was beauty in the harshness, too. The world transformed under snow and ice, familiar shapes becoming strange and wonderful. The mountains glowed pink and gold at sunrise, and the stars at night were so bright and numerous they seemed close enough to touch. Sarah had never seen the sky like this, had never understood how vast the universe was until she stood in the Montana darkness and looked up. She was standing outside the boarding house one evening, watching the stars and trying to identify the constellations her father had taught her long ago, when she heard footsteps crunching in the snow behind her. She turned to find Daniel Flynn approaching, his breath steaming in the cold air. "Evening, Miss Mitchell," he said, his tone formal in the way of someone who's been taught to be polite to his elders even when he doesn't much feel like it. "Daniel, it's late for you to be out, isn't it?" He shrugged, a gesture that looked too old for his 13 years. "Couldn't sleep. Thought a walk might help." Sarah understood that feeling too well. She'd spent enough sleepless nights herself, pacing her small room until exhaustion finally dragged her under. "Want to tell me what's keeping you awake?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the mountains rather than on her. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with an emotion he was trying to suppress. "My pa wants me to quit school after this year. Says I'm old enough to work full-time at his farm, that I've learned all I need to know. Says books won't put food on the table." Sarah's heart sank. She'd suspected something like this might be coming. Daniel's father had the hardscrabble look of a man who needed every hand working just to survive, and bright children were often pulled from school to help support their families. It was a waste, but it was also the reality of frontier life. "What do you want?" she asked. "To learn," he said simply. "To read everything ever written. To understand how the world works. To be more than just another farmer scratching at dirt that barely grows anything worth harvesting." He turned to look at her then, and there was fierce intelligence in his eyes, and hunger, and fear that his hunger would go forever unsatisfied. "Is that wrong? To want more than what I was born to?" "No," Sarah said softly. "It's not wrong. It's human." "Then help me." The words came out in a rush, desperate and unguarded. "Teach me everything you can before he makes me quit. Give me enough that I can keep learning on my own, even if I'm working the farm. Please." Sarah looked at this boy, this brilliant, difficult boy who challenged her at every turn, and saw herself in his desperation. She'd wanted more too, once. She'd dreamed of going to college, of making something of herself beyond what her gender and circumstances allowed. Those dreams had died with her parents, buried under debt and her uncle's mismanagement and the hard reality of being a woman alone in the world with no resources and no protections. But maybe she could help Daniel keep his dreams alive. Maybe that could be her redemption, small as it was. "All right," she said. "We'll work something out. Extra lessons, maybe, before or after school. And I'll lend you books. You can take them home and read at night. Your father can't object to you reading on your own time." The relief on Daniel's face was almost painful to witness. "Thank you, Miss Mitchell. You don't know what this means." But she did know. She knew exactly what it meant to have someone believe you were worth investing in, to have someone see your potential and work to nurture it. She'd had that once from her father, before death took him and left her at the mercy of lesser men. They stood together in the cold for a few minutes more, watching the stars in companionable silence. Then Daniel nodded once and headed back toward home, his footsteps fading into the winter night. Sarah remained outside a while longer, thinking about promises made and debts owed, about the ways we try to repay the world for the kindness we've received or the cruelty we've endured. She was thinking about Daniel still when she finally went inside and climbed the stairs to her room. She was thinking about how she could help him, what materials she might provide, how she could pack as much knowledge as possible into whatever time they had left. She was so focused on these thoughts that she almost didn't notice the envelope that had been slid under her door. But there it was, white against the dark floorboards, her name written across the front in an unfamiliar hand. Sarah picked it up with fingers that suddenly trembled. No one here wrote to her. No one had any reason to send her correspondence. She opened it with care, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. The message was brief, written in the same unfamiliar hand. "Miss Mitchell, or should I say Miss Warren? We should talk about your past and your future. Meet me at the church tomorrow evening at 7. Come alone. A friend who knows your secret." The paper slipped from Sarah's nerveless fingers and drifted to the floor. Her real name was Catherine Warren. No one in Redemption Creek should know that. No one in all of Montana should know that. Someone had found her. The night passed in a blur of panic and desperate planning. Sarah considered running, packing her carpetbag and disappearing into the darkness before whoever had sent that note could make good on their implied threat. But where would she go? Winter had locked down the territory. The stages weren't running regularly. She'd freeze to death before she made it to the next town. And besides, running would confirm her guilt. It would turn everyone in Redemption Creek against her, would destroy whatever small good she'd managed to do here. The children would lose their teacher again. Grace would feel betrayed. Mrs. Anderson would be scandalized. No, running wasn't the answer. She had to face whoever had sent that note, Had to find out what they wanted and what they knew. Maybe it was a bluff. Maybe someone had noticed inconsistencies in her story and was fishing for information. Maybe she could brazen her way through this the way she'd brazened her way through everything else since arriving. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Sarah taught her lessons mechanically, her mind only half present while the rest raced through scenarios and possibilities. Who could know? How had they found out? What did they want? Money, probably. The note had mentioned her future, which suggested blackmail rather than immediate exposure. Someone wanted to profit from her secret. Well, she had money. $3,000 hidden in her room. She could pay to keep someone quiet, at least for a while. It would mean using the stolen funds, would mean dipping into her only security, but what choice did she have? The children noticed her distraction, but only Daniel seemed concerned enough to ask about it. "You all right, Miss Mitchell? You seem troubled." "Just tired," she lied. "The cold makes everything harder." He accepted this with a nod, though his eyes said he didn't quite believe her. Daniel was too perceptive for his own good, too attuned to the emotional currents around him. She wondered what he would think when the truth came out, as it inevitably must now. Would he feel betrayed? Would he understand that she'd been desperate? Would it matter to him that she'd genuinely tried to be a good teacher despite the lies? 7 o'clock found Sarah walking toward the church through snow that crunched beneath her boots. The sun had set an hour ago, and the temperature was dropping fast. Her breath came in white plumes, and her fingers ached with cold despite her gloves. The church was dark except for a single light visible through one window, a lantern, she thought, placed there by whoever had summoned her. She pushed open the door and stepped into the shadowed interior. The lantern sat on the pulpit, casting long shadows across the empty pews. For a moment she thought she was alone, that whoever had sent the note hadn't come. Then a figure emerged from the shadows at the back of the church. It was Marshal John Harding, the lawman from Chicago who'd sworn to find her and bring her to justice. Sarah's heart stuttered and nearly stopped. This was it, then. The end of her flight. The end of Sarah Mitchell. She thought about running, but what was the point? He'd found her. However he'd done it, he'd tracked her across half the country to this remote town. There was nowhere left to go. "Miss Warren," he said, and his voice was surprisingly gentle. "Or do you prefer Miss Mitchell now? What do you want?" Her voice came out steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Are you here to arrest me? That depends on you." He moved closer, and in the lamplight she could see his face clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with honest eyes that suggested he took his duties seriously but without the cruel satisfaction some lawmen showed in their work. "I've been following your trail for weeks. You're good at covering your tracks, I'll give you that. But you made some mistakes, and I'm patient." Sarah said nothing, waiting for him to continue. There was nothing to say, no defense to offer. She'd stolen money and fled, and now she'd been caught. "Your uncle wants you prosecuted," Harding went on. "He's been pressuring my superiors to make this a priority. Says you stole $3,000 from his safe and disappeared. Says you're a thief who needs to be brought to justice." "He stole from me first," Sarah said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "That money was my inheritance. He gambled it away and left me with nothing. I only took what was rightfully mine." "Maybe so," Harding said. "But that's not how the law sees it. The law sees a woman who broke into a safe and took money that wasn't in her possession. Intent doesn't much matter in cases like this." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes but refused to let them fall. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. "So arrest me. Take me back to Chicago. Let them put me on trial. At least it will be over." But Harding shook his head. I'm not going to arrest you, Miss Warren. At least, not yet. Hope flared in Sarah's chest, painful and desperate. What do you mean? I mean I've been making inquiries while I've been in Redemption Creek, talking to people, learning about the new schoolteacher. Everyone speaks highly of you. Says you're good with the children, patient and fair. Says you've made a real difference in a short time. He paused, seeming to measure his words carefully. I've been a lawman for 15 years, Miss Warren. I've seen real criminals, people who hurt others for profit or pleasure, who take what they want without regard for the damage they cause. You don't strike me as that kind of person. But I am a thief, Sarah said bitterly. You said so yourself. The law doesn't care about my reasons. The law cares about justice, Harding said. And sometimes justice and the letter of the law aren't quite the same thing. I've been thinking about this case for weeks now, turning it over in my mind. Your uncle is a gambler and a drunk who squandered your inheritance. That's not in dispute. I checked the records, talked to people who knew your father. The money he left you would have been substantial if it had been managed properly. Instead, your uncle treated it like his personal bank, making bad investments and worse bets until there was almost nothing left. Sarah stared at him, afraid to believe what she was hearing. Then why prosecute me at all? Because your uncle is connected. He knows people, has favors owed. He's made enough noise that my superiors can't ignore it. Harding moved to one of the pews and sat down, gesturing for Sarah to do the same. After a moment's hesitation, she joined him, maintaining a careful distance. But I've got some discretion in how I handle things. And I've got a proposition for you. What kind of proposition? Stay here. Keep teaching. Do the good work you've been doing. I'll go back to Chicago and tell your uncle I couldn't find you, that the trail went cold in Denver. He'll fume and complain, but eventually he'll give up. Men like him don't have the patience for long pursuits, especially when there's no profit in it for them. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. You'd lie for me? Risk your career? I'd be telling the truth in the way that matters most, Harding said. The trail did go cold. I lost track of you for weeks. That you happen to end up here in Redemption Creek, where a good teacher is making a real difference in children's lives, is just one of those things I never quite discovered. He turned to look at her directly, and his expression was serious. But there are conditions. Of course there were. Sarah had learned long ago that nothing came without a price. What conditions? The money. All $3,000. You send it back to your uncle anonymously. No note, no explanation. Just the money. That way, he's made whole, and the legal complaint loses most of its teeth. Hard to prosecute someone for theft when the stolen property has been returned. Sarah felt her stomach drop. The money was her only security, the only thing standing between her and destitution if everything fell apart. Without it, she'd be truly at the mercy of whatever life brought her way. That money is mine by right, she said, but the protest sounded weak even to her own ears. Maybe so. But it's also stolen property in the eyes of the law. And keeping it makes you a thief in fact, not just in legal technicality. Harding's voice was firm but not unkind. You want redemption, Miss Warren? Real redemption, not just a new name and a fresh start built on lies? Then make this right. Return what you took and earn your living honestly. Build a real life here, one that doesn't have theft as its foundation. The words cut deeper than Sarah wanted to admit because they were true. She'd been telling herself for weeks that she was justified, that her uncle's greater crime excused her smaller one. But justification wasn't the same as being right. She'd stolen, and no amount of rationalization could change that fundamental fact. If I return the money, she said slowly, what guarantee do I have that this ends? That your superiors won't send someone else, None, Harding admitted. But I'll do what I can to close the case. I'll report that I exhausted all leads and found nothing. I'll suggest that you probably left the country, maybe went to Canada or Mexico. It won't be a guarantee, but it's the best I can offer. Sarah sat in silence, weighing her options. She could refuse, could try to keep the money and take her chances. But Harding had found her once. Others might find her again. And every day she kept the stolen money was another day she'd be looking over her shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Or she could take his offer. Return the money, wipe the slate as clean as it could be wiped, and try to build something real here in Redemption Creek. It would mean being poor again, truly poor, dependent on her teaching salary and whatever she could save from it. It would mean giving up her safety net, her insurance against disaster. But it would also mean being able to look at herself in the mirror without shame, being able to accept the friendship and trust people offered without feeling like a fraud. "I'll need time," she said finally. "Time to arrange the transfer, to make sure it's done right." "You've got a week," Harding said. "I'm staying at the hotel under a false name, told people I'm a surveyor checking routes for a potential railroad line. No one has any reason to connect me to you. In a week, I'll come back here at the same time. You tell me the money's been sent, and I head back to Chicago with my report. We never see each other again, and Sarah Mitchell gets to keep teaching in Redemption Creek as long as she wants." It wasn't much of a choice, but it was more than Sarah had any right to expect. She nodded slowly. "All right. A week." Harding stood, and Sarah rose with him. He extended his hand, and after a moment she took it. His grip was firm and honest, the handshake of a man who meant what he said. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you're doing good work here. These children need someone who cares about their education, and you clearly do. Don't waste this chance." Then he was gone, slipping out of the church into the winter darkness, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of the decision she'd just made. The walk back to the boarding house felt longer than it had ever felt before. Sarah's mind raced with logistics and implications. She'd need to package the money carefully, find a way to send it that couldn't be traced back to her. She'd need to do it soon, before she could talk herself out of it, before the fear of being poor and vulnerable could override her fragile determination to do the right thing. Mrs. Anderson was already asleep when Sarah slipped into the house and climbed the stairs to her room. She lit her lamp with trembling hands and retrieved the carpetbag from where she'd hidden it beneath the floorboards under her bed. The money was still there, still waiting, $3,000 that represented everything she'd lost and everything she'd hoped to rebuild. She counted it one last time, her fingers moving automatically while her mind wandered. This money could buy her so many things. Security. Freedom to leave if she needed to. A cushion against disaster. With this money, she'd never have to depend on anyone, never have to worry about being cast out or left destitute. It was power and safety all wrapped up in paper bills. But it was also a chain, she realized. As long as she kept it, she'd be tethered to her crime, defined by her theft. She'd be Catherine Warren the thief, no matter how well she played Sarah Mitchell the schoolteacher. She'd be living a lie so fundamental that nothing built on it could ever be fully real. The next morning, Sarah walked to the Mercantile and asked Thomas Winters about sending a package to Chicago. He explained the process. She'd need to take it to the stage office when the next stage came through, probably in 3 or 4 days if the weather held. It would cost a fair amount to send something that heavy, and there was no guarantee it would arrive safely, but it was the best option available. Sarah thanked him and returned to the boarding house to prepare the package. She wrapped the money in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, then wrapped it again in brown paper and tied it with string. She addressed it to her uncle's office in her most careful printing, letters that could belong to anyone, and marked it "No Return Address." Let him wonder where it came from. Let him think whatever he wanted. The important thing was that he'd have his money back, and the legal case against her would crumble. She spent the next 3 days teaching with a strange sense of lightness, as though a burden she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten it was there had suddenly been lifted. The children noticed the change in her mood, responding with increased energy and enthusiasm. Even the Henderson boys seemed more focused, as if they could sense that Miss Mitchell had somehow become more present, more real. Daniel sought her out after school on the 3rd day, finding her at her desk as she prepared the next day's lessons. "You seem different," he observed, settling into a chair at the front of the room without being invited. His casual presumption made her smile. "Do I? Happier. Less like you're carrying the weight of the world." He studied her with those 2 intelligent eyes. "Something good happen?" Sarah considered how to answer. She couldn't tell him the truth, but she could offer him something true nonetheless. "I made a hard decision," she said, "about my past and my future. It was the right decision, but it wasn't easy. Sometimes the right things are the hardest." Daniel nodded as though this made perfect sense to him. "Like me telling my pa I want to keep studying, even if it makes him angry. Even if it means disappointing him. Exactly like that." Sarah set down her pencil and gave him her full attention. "Did you talk to him?" "Last night. He didn't take it well." Daniel's voice was carefully neutral, but Sarah could hear the hurt beneath it. "Said I was being selfish, putting my own wants ahead of the family's needs. Said education was fine for town folks who had the luxury of it, but working people couldn't afford such foolishness." "I'm sorry, Daniel." "Don't be. I expected it." He picked at a splinter on the desk, not meeting her eyes. "But I also told him I'd work twice as hard on the farm if he let me keep coming to school. Get up earlier, stay up later. Do whatever it takes to make up for the time I'm here. And I told him you'd offered me extra lessons, books to borrow. That I could keep learning even while I was working." "What did he say to that?" "He said he'd think about it." Daniel finally looked up, and there was cautious hope in his expression. "That's not a yes, but it's not a no either. It's more than I expected." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest, pride mixed with affection for this difficult, brilliant boy who was fighting so hard for his dreams. "Then we'll work with what we have. If he agrees, we'll make the most of every minute. And if he doesn't, I'll make sure you have materials to study on your own. You're too bright to let circumstances trap you, Daniel. You talk like you know something about being trapped." The observation was too perceptive, too close to truths Sarah couldn't share. She deflected with a smile. "Everyone knows something about being trapped. That's part of being human. We're all caught in circumstances we didn't choose. The question is what we do about it." "And what are you doing about yours?" "Trying to make the best of what I have. Trying to do good where I can. Trying to earn the life I want rather than just taking it." The words came out more honest than she'd intended, and she saw Daniel register them, filing them away in that sharp mind of his. He nodded slowly. "That's what I'm trying to do too, I suppose. Earn the right to something better." "Then we're in this together," Sarah said, and meant it. The stage came through on the 4th day, right on schedule despite the cold. Sarah took her carefully wrapped package to the stage office and paid the shipping fee from her meager savings, wincing at the cost but knowing it was necessary. She watched the clerk add her package to the pile of mail and freight, and felt something inside her release as it left her hands. There. It was done. The money was on its way back to Chicago, back to her uncle, back to where the law said it belonged. She was poor now. Truly poor, with nothing but her monthly salary and the few dollars she'd managed to save. If disaster struck, if she lost her position or became ill, she'd have no cushion to fall back on. She'd be at the mercy of charity and whatever help people chose to offer. But she'd also be free. Free of the guilt that had gnawed at her since leaving Chicago. Free of the constant fear of discovery. Free to build something real in Redemption Creek, something that wasn't founded on theft and lies. That evening, she walked to the church again, arriving just as the clock struck 7. Harding was waiting inside, the same lantern burning on the pulpit, the same shadows filling the corners of the room. "It's done," Sarah said without preamble. "I sent the package 4 days ago. It should reach Chicago within the week." Harding studied her face, and whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. "Good. That took courage, Miss Warren. More courage than a lot of people have. I didn't have much choice, did I? There's always a choice. You could have run again. Could have taken the money and disappeared before I had a chance to stop you. But you didn't." He pulled an envelope from his coat pocket and held it out to her. "This is the report I'm filing when I get back to Chicago. I thought you might want to see it." Sarah took the envelope with hesitant fingers and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. The report was brief and matter-of-fact, stating that Marshal John Harding had pursued leads regarding Catherine Warren's whereabouts through 3 territories, that the trail had gone cold in Denver, and that it was his professional opinion that the subject had likely fled to Canada or Mexico and would not be returning to the United States. He recommended closing the case, especially given that the stolen property had been anonymously returned to its owner, suggesting the subject had experienced remorse and made restitution. "You're really going to file this?" Sarah asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Already have. Sent it by telegraph this afternoon. Far as Chicago's concerned, this case is closed." Harding took the paper back and returned it to his pocket. "Catherine Warren is gone. But Sarah Mitchell can stay here as long as she wants, teaching children and building a life. Just make sure it's a good life, one worth the chance you've been given." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes, and this time she didn't try to stop them. "Why are you doing this for me? You don't know me. You have no reason to risk anything for someone who broke the law." "Because I believe in second chances," Harding said simply. "And because I've seen enough of the world to know that laws aren't always the same as justice. Your uncle wronged you first, and while that doesn't make what you did right, it makes it understandable. You've paid back what you took. You're doing good work here. Seems to me that's punishment and redemption all rolled into one." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing, Miss Mitchell. That teaching certificate of yours, it's a forgery, isn't it?" Sarah's breath caught. "Yes. Thought so. The signature was too perfect, too careful. A real administrator would have scrawled it." He smiled slightly. "Might want to actually earn that certificate someday. Take some classes, get proper credentials. Would make everything more secure, and you've already proven you can do the work." Then he was gone, disappearing into the winter night for the last time. Sarah stood alone in the church, tears streaming freely down her face now, and felt something break open inside her chest. Relief and gratitude and grief all mixed together, overwhelming in their intensity. She'd been given a gift she didn't deserve, a chance to start over for real this time, not as a fugitive hiding behind a false name, but as someone genuinely trying to build a better life. The next few weeks passed in a blur of teaching and settling into her new reality. Without the stolen money as security, Sarah had to learn to live within her means, carefully budgeting every dollar of her salary. Mrs. Anderson gave her a small discount on her room and board when Sarah explained she'd sent most of her savings to family back east who'd fallen on hard times. Grace helped her sew warmer clothes from fabric remnants Thomas let her have at cost. The community, in the way of small towns, quietly looked after its schoolteacher without making a fuss about it. Christmas came to Redemption Creek with snow and celebration. The church held a pageant that the children performed, with Sarah helping them prepare and Grace making costumes from whatever materials could be found. It was a simple production, rough around the edges, but the parents watched with tears in their eyes as their children recited lines and sang carols. Sarah stood at the back of the church and felt her heart swell with something she couldn't quite name. Pride, perhaps, or belonging. or the simple joy of being part of something good. After the pageant, Grace found her in the crowd. "You're crying," she observed with gentle concern. "Happy tears," Sarah said, and it was true. "I was just thinking how lucky I am to be here, to be part of this community. A few months ago, I was alone and lost and afraid. Now I have friends, work that matters, a place that feels like home." Grace squeezed her hand. "We're the lucky ones, having you here. You've made such a difference with the children. Thomas says he's never seen the town's young people so engaged with learning." The praise warmed Sarah from the inside out, but it also reminded her of how close she'd come to losing all of this. If Harding had been a different kind of lawman, if he'd simply arrested her and taken her back to Chicago, none of this would exist. She'd be in a cell awaiting trial, and these children would be without a teacher again, and Grace would never have become her friend. She'd been given a second chance, and she was determined not to waste it. Winter deepened its grip on Montana, and the town settled into the quiet rhythm of short days and long nights. School continued despite the cold, though attendance dropped when storms made travel dangerous. Sarah used those days when only a few students could make it to provide extra attention, working with individuals on their weaknesses and helping them catch up on material they'd missed. Daniel Flynn became her most dedicated student, arriving early and staying late, soaking up knowledge like parched earth soaking up rain. His father had grudgingly agreed to let him continue his education, though the cost was visible in the exhaustion that sometimes shadowed Daniel's eyes. He was keeping his promise to work harder on the farm, rising before dawn to complete chores before school and working again after lessons ended. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Sarah told him one afternoon in late January when she caught him nodding off over his arithmetic. "I'm fine," he insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Daniel." She waited until he looked at her. "I'm proud of your commitment to learning. But education isn't worth destroying your health over. If you need to miss a day to rest, that's all right. The lessons will still be here when you're ready." "Can't miss any more than necessary," he said stubbornly. "Every day I'm here is a day my pa could change his mind, decide it's not worth it after all. I have to make the most of whatever time I get." Sarah understood that desperation too well, the sense of time running out and opportunities slipping away. But she also knew that Daniel was too young to carry such heavy burdens alone. "Then let me help you more efficiently. I'll create a reading list for you, books arranged by subject and difficulty. You can work through them systematically at your own pace. And I'll give you written notes on key concepts so you can study at home when you can't be here. We'll make every moment count." The gratitude in Daniel's expression made Sarah's heart ache. This was what teaching could be at its best. Not just transferring information but opening doors, creating possibilities, showing young people that they had value and potential beyond what their circumstances suggested. This was work worth doing, worth sacrificing for, worth building a life around. February brought a brief thaw that fooled everyone into thinking spring might come early. The snow melted into mud, and the world looked brown and tired. Then winter returned with a vengeance, dumping 2 feet of snow overnight and trapping everyone inside for 3 days. School was cancelled, and Sarah spent the time in her room reading and planning lessons and thinking about her future. She'd been in Redemption Creek for 4 months now. 4 months of teaching, of making friends, of slowly becoming Sarah Mitchell in ways that went beyond just using the name. She was building a real life here, putting down roots that went deeper than she'd intended. The thought of leaving, of moving on to some other town, some other identity, felt wrong now in a way it hadn't before. Maybe this was where she was meant to be. Maybe this was the redemption Harding had talked about, not just returning the money but actually earning her place in the world through honest work and genuine connection. Maybe Catherine Warren really was gone, and Sarah Mitchell could be the woman who remained. When the snow finally stopped and the town dug itself out, Sarah was among the first to venture outside. She walked through the white landscape to the schoolhouse, even though classes wouldn't resume for another day, and stood in the empty classroom looking at the benches and slates and books. This was hers now, she realized. Not because of a forged certificate or a desperate lie, but because she'd done the work, earned the trust, proven herself capable. She was a teacher not just in name but in fact. The door opened behind her, and she turned to find Grace entering with a basket over her arm. "Thought you might be here," Grace said with a smile. "Brought you some lunch. Figured you'd be making plans rather than resting." They sat together at Sarah's desk, sharing bread and cheese while Grace chatted about the storm and town gossip. It was comfortable, easy, the kind of friendship Sarah had never quite managed before. She'd been too guarded, too afraid of letting people close enough to see her clearly. But with Grace, she'd slowly learned to relax, to share pieces of herself that were real even if they came wrapped in careful omissions. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said suddenly, her tone shifting to something more serious. Sarah's guard came up instinctively. "Of course. Are you happy here? Really happy, I mean. Not just making the best of things, but actually content with your life in Redemption Creek." The question caught Sarah off balance. Was she happy? She'd been so focused on survival, on maintaining her deception and avoiding discovery, that she hadn't stopped to consider whether she was actually happy. But as she thought about it, she realized the answer was yes. Despite everything, despite the lies and the fear and the narrow escape from her past, she was happy here. She had work that mattered, friends who cared about her, a sense of purpose and belonging she'd never experienced before. "I am," she said, and heard the surprise in her own voice. "I never expected to be, but I am." Grace's smile was radiant. "I'm glad. You deserve happiness, Sarah. You've worked so hard, done so much good. It's nice to see you finally letting yourself enjoy it." Letting herself enjoy it. That was the key, wasn't it? She'd been so busy being afraid, so focused on what she might lose, that she'd forgotten to appreciate what she had. She'd been given a second chance, and instead of living in fear of losing it, maybe she should be grateful for having it at all. March arrived with the first hints of spring. Warmer days, melting snow, birds returning from wherever they'd spent the winter. The town began to wake from its hibernation, people venturing out more, children playing in the muddy streets. Sarah opened the schoolhouse windows for the first time in months, letting fresh air sweep away the staleness of winter. And then, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, everything changed. Sarah was teaching the older students about westward expansion when Daniel raised his hand, his expression troubled. "Miss Mitchell, there's a man standing outside watching us." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She moved to the window, trying to keep her expression calm, and looked out. A stranger stood in the street, a tall man in a dark coat, his attention fixed on the schoolhouse. He wasn't Harding. She'd know Harding anywhere now. This was someone new, someone she didn't recognize. Had another marshal been sent? Had her uncle found a way to reopen the case? Had everything Harding done been for nothing? She forced herself to turn back to her students, forced her voice to remain steady. "It's nothing to worry about. Probably just someone passing through. Now, who can tell me about the Oregon Trail?" But her mind was racing, planning escape routes and calculating odds. She'd been a fool to think she could stay here, to think one marshal's kindness would be enough to protect her forever. She'd let herself get comfortable, let her guard down, and now she'd pay the price. The lesson continued, but Sarah's attention was split between her students and the window, watching for the stranger's next move. When the lunch break came, she dismissed the children with instructions to return promptly at 1 o'clock, then stood at the window and watched the stranger approach the schoolhouse. He climbed the steps and knocked, and Sarah's hands shook as she called for him to enter. The door swung open, and the stranger stepped inside. He was younger than she'd thought, maybe 25, with nervous energy and kind eyes. "Miss Mitchell?" he asked. "Yes." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm James Peterson." I'm a teacher myself, from Helena. I've been traveling through the territory looking at different schools, trying to improve my own methods." He smiled sheepishly. "I heard about the work you're doing here, about how you've engaged even the difficult students. I was hoping I might observe your afternoon lessons, see what I could learn from you." Relief washed over Sarah so intensely she had to grip the edge of her desk to stay upright. Not a marshal. Not a threat. Just a teacher, looking to learn. "Of course," she managed. "You're welcome to observe. I'm always happy to share what I've learned." James Peterson stayed for the afternoon session, watching with genuine interest as Sarah guided her students through geography and literature. She was self-conscious at first, aware of being watched and evaluated, but gradually she fell into the rhythm of teaching and forgot he was there. The students performed well, eager to show off for the visitor, and even the Henderson boys behaved themselves. After school, Peterson thanked her profusely, praising her methods and asking questions about how she structured her lessons. "You have a real gift," he said. "These children are lucky to have you." The words warmed her, but they also reminded her of how fragile this all was. She wasn't a real teacher, not in the way Peterson was. She'd never been to normal school, never taken pedagogy courses, never earned the credentials that would make her legitimate. She was an imposter who'd gotten lucky, and sooner or later her luck would run out. After Peterson left, Sarah sat at her desk in the empty schoolhouse and finally allowed herself to acknowledge the fear that had been gnawing at her all day. She'd thought she was safe, thought Harding's intervention had bought her permanent security. But today had shown her how quickly that security could dissolve, how easily a stranger's presence could shatter her fragile peace. She couldn't live like this forever, jumping at shadows and fearing every unfamiliar face. She needed something more solid, something that would make her place here unquestionable. And there was only one way to get it. That evening, Sarah wrote a letter to the Territorial Education Board in Helena, explaining that she'd been teaching in Redemption Creek for several months and wished to earn proper certification. She detailed her experience, listed the subjects she taught, and asked what requirements she'd need to fulfill. It was a risk. The application process might require background information she couldn't safely provide, but it was a necessary risk. If she was going to stay here, if she was going to build a real life as Sarah Mitchell, she needed legitimate credentials to support that life. The response came 6 weeks later, a formal letter outlining the requirements for teacher certification in the Montana Territory. She'd need to pass examinations in the core subjects, submit letters of recommendation from community members, and complete a probationary teaching period under observation. The probationary period could be waived if she could demonstrate a year of successful teaching experience, which she nearly had. Sarah read the letter 3 times, relief and determination warring in her chest. This was achievable. She could pass the examinations. She'd been teaching this material for months and knew it cold. She could get letters of recommendation from Grace and Thomas, from parents whose children she'd taught, from Reverend Thompson who'd seen her work with the community. She could earn this certification honestly, make herself legitimate in ways that had nothing to do with forged documents and false names. She began studying in earnest, reviewing material she'd covered with her students and reading ahead in subjects where she felt less confident. Grace noticed her increased focus and offered to help quiz her, turning their evening sewing sessions into impromptu study halls. Thomas lent her books from his personal collection, works on history and science that expanded her knowledge beyond the basic primers she'd been teaching from. The children noticed her studying too, and it sparked something in them. If Miss Mitchell was still learning, still working to improve herself, then maybe learning wasn't something you aged out of. Maybe it was a lifetime pursuit, something worth doing even when it was hard. Daniel especially seemed energized by the example, attacking his own studies with renewed vigor. Summer came to Redemption Creek with warmth and long days that felt like gifts after the brutal winter. School let out in early June, and Sarah found herself with time to prepare for her certification examinations, scheduled for August in Helena. She'd need to make the journey there, spend several days taking tests and meeting with education officials, but Mrs. Anderson had agreed to let her room go temporarily, and Grace had promised to look after her few possessions. The night before she left for Helena, the town threw her a small party at the church. It wasn't anything fancy, just food and conversation and good wishes, but Sarah was deeply moved by the gesture. These people cared about her, believed in her, wanted her to succeed. Whatever else she was, whatever secrets she still carried, she was genuinely part of this community now. Grace pulled her aside as the evening was winding down. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "When you first arrived, you seemed so lost, so afraid. But you've grown into yourself here. You've become the teacher these children needed, and more than that, you've become a friend to all of us. No matter what happens in Helena, know that you've already proven yourself where it matters most." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For believing in me when I wasn't sure I believed in myself." The journey to Helena took 2 days on the stage, and Sarah spent the time reviewing her notes and trying to calm her nerves. The examinations would be rigorous, she knew. The territory couldn't afford to certify incompetent teachers, not when education was so crucial to building civilization in the frontier. She'd have to demonstrate real knowledge and teaching ability, not just the ability to fake it. The examinations were held in a stern building that housed the territorial government offices. Sarah presented herself at the appointed time, her forged certificate carefully left behind in Redemption Creek, and was shown to a room where 3 examiners waited. They were serious people, 2 men and a woman, all with the look of educators who took their profession seriously. For 3 days, they tested her. Written examinations in mathematics, literature, history, and science. Oral examinations where she had to explain concepts and defend her teaching methods. Practical demonstrations where she taught sample lessons to children brought in for the purpose. It was exhausting and nerve-wracking, and several times Sarah was certain she'd failed, that her inadequate preparation would be revealed and she'd be sent back to Redemption Creek in shame. But when it was over, when she'd answered the last question and taught the final demonstration lesson, the lead examiner surprised her with a smile. "Miss Mitchell, I must say, you're one of the most naturally gifted teachers we've examined in some time. Your methods are unconventional in places, but your results speak for themselves." The letters of recommendation we received from Redemption Creek were glowing. Sarah barely dared to breathe. "Does that mean?" "It means you've passed. Congratulations. You're now a certified teacher in the Montana Territory." The woman examiner stepped forward with an official document, sealed and signed, that proclaimed Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell qualified to teach in territorial schools. "Use this well. The children of Montana need good teachers like you." Sarah took the certificate with shaking hands, staring at it as though it might disappear if she looked away. This was real. This was legitimate. She'd earned this through her own abilities and hard work, not through deception and forgery. Whatever else was false about her identity, this was true. She was a real teacher now, properly certified and legally recognized. The return journey to Redemption Creek felt different from the trip out. Sarah sat in the stage with her new certificate carefully protected in her bag, watching the landscape roll by, and felt something settle into place inside her. She'd done it. She'd taken the fake identity she'd assumed out of desperation and made it real through effort and determination. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just a name anymore. She was a person, complete and legitimate, with credentials that couldn't be questioned. The town welcomed her back with genuine celebration. Someone had painted a banner across the schoolhouse door, "Congratulations, Miss Mitchell, certified teacher." Children ran up to hug her, parents shook her hand, Grace cried happy tears. It was overwhelming and wonderful and everything Sarah had never dared to dream she might have. That night, alone in her room, she took out the journal she'd been keeping since arriving in Redemption Creek. She paged through months of entries, watching her transformation unfold in her own handwriting. The fear and desperation of those first weeks. The slow building of confidence as she learned to teach. The friendships formed and deepened. The crisis when Harding found her and the choice she'd made to return the stolen money. The decision to earn legitimate certification. It was all there, a record of how Catherine Warren had died and Sarah Mitchell had been born. She turned to a fresh page and began to write. Today I became real. Not just in name, but in fact. I am Sarah Mitchell, certified teacher, member of the Redemption Creek community, friend to Grace Winters and teacher to Daniel Flynn and all the others. The woman I was before is gone, and I don't mourn her. She made mistakes born of desperation and fear, but she also had the courage to start over, to try to build something better. I won't pretend the road was easy or that I did everything right. I lied to good people. I stole money, even if I believed it was rightfully mine. I ran from justice and hid behind a false name. These are facts I can't erase, mistakes I can't undo. But I can move forward. I can be better than I was. I can teach with integrity and live with honesty. I can be the person these children need, the friend Grace deserves, the teacher this community believes me to be. Marshal Harding gave me a second chance when I had no right to expect one. He believed I could be more than my worst mistake, and he was willing to risk his career to prove it. I owe it to him, and to myself, and to everyone who's shown me kindness in this place, to make sure his faith wasn't misplaced. So this is my promise, written here where only I will see it. I will be Sarah Mitchell for the rest of my life. I will teach these children and the children who come after them. I will be a good friend, an honest person, a contributing member of this community. I will earn the life I've been given every single day, until the day I die. Catherine Warren made terrible choices, but she's gone now. Only Sarah Mitchell remains, and she will be better. Sarah closed the journal and tucked it away, then extinguished her lamp and climbed into bed. Through her window, she could see stars scattered across the Montana sky, countless and brilliant. Somewhere out there was the woman she'd been, the life she'd left behind, the mistakes she could never fully escape. But here, in this room, in this town, in this life she'd built from desperation and determination, was the woman she'd chosen to become. The next morning was Sunday, and Sarah dressed with care for church. She'd become a regular attendee over the months, finding comfort in the ritual and community even if she still struggled with the spiritual aspects. Reverend Thompson's sermons on grace and forgiveness resonated differently now that she'd experienced both firsthand. She understood in her bones what it meant to be given something you didn't deserve, to be offered a chance at redemption you hadn't earned. The church was full that morning, the whole town packed into the small building to hear the Reverend speak. Sarah took her usual seat beside Grace and tried to focus on the service, but her mind kept wandering to thoughts of the future. What would the coming school year bring? Would Daniel's father continue to let him attend? Would new families arrive in Redemption Creek, bringing new students? Would she finally feel secure enough to stop looking over her shoulder? After the service, Reverend Thompson approached her with a request. "Miss Mitchell, I was wondering if you might consider teaching Sunday school for the children. We've never had anyone with proper training willing to do it, and I think it would benefit the young people greatly." Sarah hesitated. Teaching Sunday school felt like a step too far into the life of the church, into territory where her incomplete faith might be exposed. But she also recognized the opportunity it represented, another way to integrate herself into the community, another role that would make her indispensable and therefore safe. "I'd be honored," she said, and saw the Reverend's face light up with pleasure. "Wonderful. We can start next week. I'll spread the word to the families." As she walked back to the boarding house with Grace, Sarah reflected on how quickly she'd agreed. A year ago, she would have refused, would have seen the risk in taking on more visibility. But she was different now. Stronger. More confident in her ability to maintain her identity and her place in this community. The fear that had defined her first months in Redemption Creek had faded to a manageable caution, present but no longer paralyzing. "You're quiet," Grace observed. "Worried about the Sunday school?" "A little," Sarah admitted. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach children about faith when my own is so uncertain." Grace laughed softly. "Sarah, I don't think anyone's faith is as certain as they pretend it is. We're all just doing our best to understand things bigger than ourselves. The children need someone who'll be honest with them about the struggle, not someone who pretends to have all the answers." It was good advice, and Sarah took it to heart. When she began teaching Sunday school the following week, she approached it the same way she approached regular school, with honesty, patience, and a willingness to admit when she didn't know something. The children responded well, asking questions that showed they'd been thinking deeply about spiritual matters, sharing their own doubts and confusions. It became less about teaching doctrine and more about exploring ideas together, and Sarah found herself enjoying it far more than she'd expected. Summer ripened into full warmth, and Sarah spent her days reading, preparing for the fall term, and helping Grace in the mercantile. The work was simple and grounding, a pleasant change from the intensity of teaching. She learned the prices of goods, the names of regular customers, the small dramas that played out in a general store where people came as much for gossip as for supplies. One afternoon in late July, a stranger rode into town on a fine horse, his clothes marking him as someone of means. Sarah was helping Grace inventory fabric when the man entered the store, and something about the way he carried himself made her tense. He had the look of someone accustomed to authority, someone who asked questions and expected answers. "Help you, sir?" Thomas emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on his apron. "I'm looking for information about a teacher," the man said, and Sarah's blood turned to ice. "A woman named Catherine Warren. I've reason to believe she may have passed through this area." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Sarah gripped the bolt of fabric she'd been holding, her knuckles white. This was it. The moment she'd been dreading, the end of everything she'd built. Someone had found her after all. But Thomas just shook his head. "Don't know anyone by that name. We've got a teacher here, Miss Sarah Mitchell, but she's from Denver originally. Been teaching here near on a year now." This Catherine Warren would have arrived last fall, probably traveling alone, possibly using a false name. The stranger pulled out a photograph and set it on the counter. "This is what she looked like, though she may have changed her appearance." Sarah couldn't see the photograph from where she stood, but she didn't need to. It would be her face, probably from some formal portrait she'd sat for years ago. Her heart hammered so hard she thought everyone in the store must be able to hear it. Grace moved to the counter to look at the photograph, and Sarah held her breath. Grace had seen her face every day for months. If anyone would recognize her, it would be Grace. But Grace just studied the image and shook her head. "Pretty woman, but I've never seen her." "Who is she?" "Someone who needs to be found," the stranger said vaguely. "If you hear anything, there's a reward." He left a card with his information and walked out, his boots loud on the wooden floor. Sarah stood frozen in place, unable to move or speak. Grace had looked at her photograph and claimed not to recognize her. Either Sarah had changed more than she realized over the past year, the weight she'd lost, the lines worry had carved around her eyes, the way she styled her hair now, or Grace had recognized her and chosen to lie. After Thomas went back to his work, Grace turned to Sarah with an expression that was both knowing and kind. "You all right? You look pale." "I'm fine," Sarah managed. "Just warm. Maybe I should step outside for some air." But Grace caught her arm gently as she passed. "Sarah," she said quietly, so Thomas wouldn't hear, "whatever you're running from, it's safe with me. You're a good person and a good teacher. That's all that matters." Tears stung Sarah's eyes. "Grace, Hush. You don't need to tell me anything. I'm just saying I know quality when I see it, and you've got it in spades. The woman in that photograph, whoever she is, she's got nothing to do with the Sarah Mitchell I know." Grace squeezed her arm once and let go. "Now go get some air. And Sarah, welcome home." Sarah stumbled outside into the bright afternoon, her vision blurred with tears. Grace knew. Had probably known for months, or at least suspected. And she'd lied to the stranger without hesitation, had protected Sarah without being asked. The gift of that loyalty, that friendship, was so overwhelming that Sarah had to lean against the building to keep from collapsing. She'd been given another chance, another reprieve. But more than that, she'd been given proof that she wasn't alone anymore, that someone knew her secrets and accepted her anyway. Grace had seen who she really was, not just Sarah Mitchell the schoolteacher, but the frightened woman underneath, and had chosen friendship over judgment. That evening, Sarah walked to the Winters' home for supper as she often did. Grace greeted her at the door with a hug, and nothing more was said about the stranger or the photograph. They ate together as a family, the children chattering about their day, Thomas reading bits from the newspaper, Grace serving food and joining conversations in equal measure. It was ordinary and perfect, and Sarah felt her fear slowly dissolve into gratitude. After supper, while Thomas played with the children and Sarah helped Grace clean up, Grace spoke quietly. "I meant what I said earlier. You don't owe me any explanations. But if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." Sarah dried a plate carefully, considering her words. She'd spent so long guarding her secrets, afraid that sharing them would destroy everything. But maybe secrets only had power when they were kept in darkness. Maybe bringing them into the light would rob them of their ability to hurt her. "My real name is Catherine Warren," she said softly. "I stole money from my uncle after he gambled away my inheritance. I ran from Chicago with a forged teaching certificate and $3,000 in cash. A marshal tracked me down, but he gave me a chance to make things right. I returned the money and earned a real teaching certificate. The woman in that photograph is who I used to be. Sarah Mitchell is who I am now." Grace listened without interrupting, her hands still in the dishwater. When Sarah finished, she nodded slowly. "Thank you for trusting me with that. It doesn't change anything. You're still my friend, still the teacher this town needs. But I'm glad you felt you could tell me." "Why did you lie for me?" Sarah asked. "You didn't have to. You could have told the truth and no one would have blamed you. Because I've seen how hard you work, how much you care about those children. Because I've watched you become part of this community and make it better by being here. Because everyone deserves a second chance, and you've clearly made the most of yours." Grace pulled her hands from the water and dried them on her apron. Besides, the woman in that photograph, she looked desperate and afraid. "You don't look like that anymore. You look like someone who's found where she belongs. So as far as I'm concerned, that really isn't you in the picture. That's someone else entirely." Sarah felt fresh tears threaten. "I don't deserve your friendship." "Probably not," Grace agreed with a small smile. "But you've got it anyway. That's the thing about grace, Sarah. It's not about deserving. It's about being loved anyway." The stranger left town the next day, and Sarah never learned who he was or who had sent him. Her uncle, probably, still bitter about the money even though he'd gotten it back. Or perhaps someone else from her old life who had reasons to track her down. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd found nothing, that her secret was safe, that Grace had protected her without hesitation. August turned to September, and Sarah prepared to begin her second year of teaching in Redemption Creek. This time, she wasn't nervous or uncertain. She knew the children, knew the material, knew her own capabilities. She'd earned her place here honestly, and she wore her certified teacher status like armor against doubt. The first day of the new school year brought familiar faces and a few new ones. Families who'd heard about the good teacher in Redemption Creek and had moved to the area specifically to access better education for their children. Sarah welcomed them all, learning names and assessing abilities, already planning how to challenge each student appropriately. Daniel Flynn returned, taller than he'd been in spring and burning with intellectual hunger. His father had agreed to let him continue through this year, though what would happen after that remained uncertain. Sarah was determined to give him everything she could while she had the chance. Over the months that followed, Sarah settled into a rhythm that felt less like playing a role and more like living a life. She taught her classes with confidence and creativity. She led Sunday school with honest questioning rather than false certainty. She spent evenings with Grace and Thomas, becoming part of their family in ways that felt natural and earned. She corresponded with other teachers in the territory, sharing methods and materials, building a professional network that made her feel legitimate in ways she'd never experienced before. Winter came again, harsh and beautiful, and this time Sarah faced it without fear. She'd proven she could survive a Montana winter. She'd proven she could teach effectively even in difficult conditions. She'd proven she belonged here, had earned her place through work and dedication rather than deception. On Christmas Eve, the church held another pageant, and Sarah's Sunday school students performed the Nativity story with touching sincerity. Watching them, seeing how much they'd grown in understanding and confidence, Sarah felt a peace settle over her that had nothing to do with the holiday and everything to do with purpose fulfilled. She was doing exactly what she was meant to do, being exactly who she was meant to be. After the pageant, Reverend Thompson approached her with a serious expression. "Miss Mitchell, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Sarah's old fears stirred, but she pushed them down and followed him to his office. Whatever this was, she'd face it directly rather than running. The Reverend closed the door and gestured for her to sit. "I wanted to speak with you about something that's been on my mind for some time. You've become an important part of this community, and I think it's time someone acknowledged that officially." Sarah waited, unsure where this was going. "The town council has been discussing our future growth and stability. We're attracting new families because of the quality of education available here, because of you. They'd like to formalize your position, give you a contract that guarantees employment and includes a small increase in salary. It would mean committing to stay in Redemption Creek for at least 3 more years, but it would also mean security and recognition of your value to this town." 3 years. The words hung in the air between them. 3 years of staying in one place, of building a life, of commitment. 3 years during which something from her past might still surface, might still destroy everything. But also 3 years of teaching children who needed her, of friendship with Grace, of being Sarah Mitchell so completely that Catherine Warren would fade to nothing more than a distant memory. "I'd be honored," Sarah said without hesitation. "Redemption Creek is my home now. I can't imagine being anywhere else." The Reverend smiled, clearly pleased. "The town will be glad to hear it. You've made such a difference here, Sarah. More than you probably realize." Walking back to the boarding house that night, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The desperation that had driven her from Chicago. The fear that had defined her first months in Montana. The kindness of strangers who'd become friends. The unexpected grace of a lawman who'd believed she could be better than her worst mistake. The hard work of earning legitimacy and the slow building of a real life. She thought about Catherine Warren, the woman she'd been, angry and desperate and willing to steal what she thought she deserved. That woman was gone now, had died somewhere between Chicago and Redemption Creek, between theft and restitution, between lies and earned truth. In her place was Sarah Mitchell, a woman who taught children and led Sunday school and had friends who would lie to protect her and a community that valued her contribution. It wasn't the life Sarah had imagined for herself when she was young. It was better. It was real. It was hers. Spring came early that year, the snow melting weeks ahead of schedule. The town emerged from winter's grip with renewed energy, ready to build and plant and grow. Sarah watched the transformation with a sense of belonging that went bone deep. She was part of this place now, woven into its fabric as surely as Grace and Thomas, as established as the church and the mercantile. One afternoon in late April, as she was dismissing her students for the day, Daniel approached her desk with unusual solemnity. "Miss Mitchell, I need to tell you something." Sarah set down her papers, giving him her full attention. "What is it, Daniel?" "My pa says this is my last year of school. Says I'm needed full-time on the farm come summer, and that's that. No more lessons, no more books except what I can manage on my own." His voice was steady, but Sarah could see the pain behind his careful control. "I wanted to thank you for everything you've taught me, for believing I was worth teaching, for giving me extra lessons and lending me books and showing me there's more to the world than what I can see from our farm." Sarah felt her heart break a little for this brilliant boy who deserved so much more than circumstances would allow. But she also felt fierce pride in how far he'd come, how much he'd learned, how well prepared he was to continue his education on his own. "You don't need to thank me, Daniel. Teaching you has been one of the great privileges of my life. And this isn't the end of your education, it's just a change in how you pursue it." She pulled a package from her desk drawer, something she'd been preparing for weeks in anticipation of this moment. "These are for you. Books I've purchased with my own money, ones I think will challenge and inspire you. A complete works of Shakespeare, a volume on advanced mathematics, books on history and science and philosophy. They're yours to keep, to read whenever you have time. And I want you to write to me, tell me what you're learning, ask questions when you're stuck. I may not be your teacher in a classroom anymore, but I'll always be your teacher if you want me to be." Daniel took the package with shaking hands, his careful composure finally cracking. "Miss Mitchell, thank you. I'll never forget this. I'll never forget you. And I'll never forget you, Daniel Flynn. You're going to do remarkable things with your life. I know it." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the empty schoolhouse and let herself cry. Not from sadness, though there was sadness in watching a gifted student forced to leave school too early, but also from pride and hope and the knowledge that she'd made a real difference in at least one life. Whatever else happened, however her story ultimately ended, she'd done something good here. She'd helped a brilliant boy understand his own potential. That mattered. That would always matter. Summer arrived with warmth and long evenings, and Sarah spent her time reading, planning for the next school year, and helping Grace with the constant work of running the mercantile. It was peaceful, this life she'd built. Simple in the best ways. Full of small joys and meaningful work and relationships that fed her soul. One evening in July, she was walking back from supper at the Winters' home when she noticed a figure sitting on the steps of the boarding house. As she drew closer, she recognized Marshal Harding, looking older and more tired than she remembered, but still carrying that air of quiet authority. Sarah's heart jumped, old fears surging before she could stop them. But Harding held up a hand in a gesture of peace. "Easy, Miss Mitchell. I'm not here on official business. Just passing through and thought I'd check on you." Sarah sat down beside him, leaving space between them but close enough to talk quietly. "Why are you really here? Honestly?" "Because I wanted to see if my gamble paid off. If giving you a second chance was the right decision." He looked at her with those honest eyes. "I've made a lot of hard calls in my career, but that one kept me up nights, wondering if I'd made a mistake, if you'd run again or fall back into old patterns, wondering if I was too soft, too willing to see the best in people." "And?" Sarah asked quietly. "What do you think now?" Harding smiled. "I think I made the right call. I've been in town for 2 days, asking around, listening to what people say about their teacher. They love you, Miss Mitchell. Think you hung the moon. Those children in your school are getting an education that would make most city schools jealous. And you earned that teaching certificate honestly, which takes courage." Relief and gratitude washed through Sarah in equal measure. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself, for giving me the chance to become someone better. You did that part yourself. I just got out of the way." He stood, preparing to leave. I won't bother you again. As far as I'm concerned, Catherine Warren doesn't exist anymore. There's only Sarah Mitchell, schoolteacher, and she's doing just fine." He tipped his hat to her and walked away into the gathering dusk, and Sarah sat on the steps watching him go. Another piece of her past acknowledged and released. Another door closed on the woman she'd been, another step forward as the woman she'd become. The years that followed blurred together in the best possible way, not because they were unmemorable, but because they were filled with the comfortable rhythms of a life well lived. Sarah taught successive classes of students, watched them grow and learn and eventually leave for lives of their own. She continued leading Sunday school, finding her own faith strengthening as she helped children explore theirs. She deepened her friendship with Grace until they were as close as sisters, sharing everything from recipes to secrets to dreams for the future. Daniel wrote to her faithfully from his father's farm, describing the books he was reading and the ideas he was wrestling with. His letters showed a mind that continued to grow despite limited formal education, and Sarah responded with encouragement and recommendations for further reading. She sent him books when she could afford them, investing in his future the way someone had once invested in hers. New families continued arriving in Redemption Creek, drawn by reports of good schools and a stable community. The town grew slowly but steadily, adding new buildings and new opportunities. Sarah's role expanded with the growth. She became involved in planning for a larger school building, in recruiting additional teachers, in developing a curriculum that would serve the territory's needs. 5 years after her arrival in Redemption Creek, the town held a celebration to dedicate the new school building, a proper 2-room structure with glass windows and a bell that could be heard throughout the valley. Sarah stood at the dedication ceremony, listening to speeches about progress and education and building for the future, and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This building existed in part because of her work, because she'd proven the value of good education and inspired the community to invest in it. Grace stood beside her, holding her hand the way sisters do. "You did this," she whispered. "Don't ever forget that." But Sarah knew it wasn't just her doing. It was the combined effort of an entire community that believed in education and was willing to sacrifice for it. It was parents who sent their children faithfully despite needing their labor. It was Thomas Winters donating materials at cost. It was Reverend Thompson preaching sermons about the value of learning. It was everyone working together toward something bigger than themselves. That night, alone in her room in the boarding house, the same room she'd occupied since moving out of the Winters home years ago, Sarah took out her journal for the first time in months. She'd fallen out of the habit of regular writing, too busy living her life to spend time recording it. But tonight felt like a moment worth marking. 10 years ago, I was someone else entirely, she wrote. I was Catherine Warren, a woman so desperate and angry that she committed a crime and fled from the consequences. I thought my life was over, that I'd never have anything good again. I was wrong. The life I have now is better than anything I could have imagined. I'm respected in my community, valued for my work, surrounded by people who care about me. I teach children who grow up to be good citizens, who carry forward the knowledge I've given them. I have friends who know my worst secrets and love me anyway. I have purpose and belonging and peace. Catherine Warren made terrible mistakes, but she also had the courage to try again. To run toward something instead of just away from something. To accept a second chance and make the most of it. I owe her that acknowledgement, even as I leave her behind. Sarah Mitchell is who I am now, who I will remain for the rest of my days. Not because a forged certificate says so, but because I've earned this identity through years of honest work and genuine connection. I am a teacher. I am a friend. I am a valued member of this community. These things are true because I made them true. If I could speak to the woman I was 10 years ago, frightened and desperate and running through the night with stolen money in her bag, I would tell her that it gets better, that the hard choices lead somewhere good, that redemption is real and second chances exist and you can build a life worth living even after you've made mistakes that seem unforgivable. I would tell her to keep going, to accept help when it's offered, To work hard and be honest and give more than she takes. To believe that she can be better than her worst moment. I would tell her that someday she'll sit in a small room in Montana and write these words, and she'll be happy. Genuinely, deeply happy. And that happiness will be earned through effort and courage and the willingness to become someone new. I would tell her it's worth it. Every hard step, every moment of fear, every sacrifice, it's all worth it for the life that waits at the end of the road. Sarah closed the journal and set it aside, then moved to her window to look out at the town she'd called home for a decade. Lights glowed in windows across Redemption Creek. Somewhere out there, Grace was probably putting her children to bed. Daniel was reading by lamplight on his father's farm. Families were gathering for evening prayers and quiet conversations. The whole town was settling into the peaceful rhythms of a summer night. And she was part of it all, woven into this community as surely as any thread in a tapestry. Not perfect, she'd never be perfect, and she'd stop trying to be. But good. Useful. Valued. Loved. Sarah Mitchell had come to Redemption Creek 10 years ago claiming to be a schoolteacher while running from the law. But over time, through work and grace and the kindness of good people, the lie had become truth. She was a schoolteacher now, in every way that mattered. And she was no longer running. She was home.